Perfecto, vamos a comenzar nuestro conversatorio. Hola a todos y todas, ¿cómo están? En nombre del Centro de Estudios de Relaciones Internacionales de la Facultad de Gobierno, les doy la bienvenida al conversatorio Expansionismo chino y su ambición regional. Pronto los dejaré con Francisco Parada, investigador del centro y quien va a moderar la actividad, pero antes les comparto algunas indicaciones generales. Dejaremos entre 15 a 20 minutos al final para responder sus preguntas. Las deben hacer en la sección preguntas y respuestas o Q&A si tienen Zoom en inglés. Este botón lo encuentran en la barra que está abajo. También les recuerdo que todas nuestras actividades son informadas por email y por redes sociales, así que los invito a que nos sigan en Facebook, Twitter e Instagram. Nos encuentran como @gobierno UDD. Así que a continuación los dejo con Francisco Parada, que disfruten este conversatorio.
Good morning. I would like to start introducing our guest. Today we have the pleasure to have with us Professor Daniel Markey, who's a senior research professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He's also the academic director of the Johns Hopkins SAIS Global Policy Program. Before that, between 2007 and 2015, Professor Markey was a senior fellow for India, Pakistan, and South Asia at the Council on Foreign Relations. While there, he wrote a really important book called on the US-Pakistan relations, called No Exit from Pakistan, America's Tortured Relationship with Islamabad. And before that, between 2003 and 2007, Dr. Markey held the Southeast Asia portfolio for the Secretary Policy Planning Staff of the US Department of State. Prior to his government service, he taught at the Department of Politics at Princeton University. Welcome, Professor Markey, to our conversation. Today we're going to talk a little bit on your book called China's Western Horizon, Beijing and the New Geopolitics of Eurasia, which was released this year. First of all, I wanted to congratulate you on your book, which is outstanding.
Thank you.
And to welcome you to our Chilean audience. This Zoom is broadcast through YouTube and our channels. And well, let's start a little bit with the current situation, because obviously we are facing a really strange time in geopolitics. This new disease, COVID-19, has changed all the traditional settings, political scenarios, the supply chains, and has become a huge chain reaction in all possible settings. But China has somehow withstood this terrible disease and has managed to continue with their own plans and so on. Increasingly seeing their economy that has not dropped so much, they have continued, and nowadays they enjoy practically a normal life. But their geopolitics has changed, especially since Xi Jinping came into power. And I wanted to start with a really important phrase you actually say in your book, especially when you actually state what Xiaoping said in 1990, which China should observe calmly, secure our position, cope with affairs calmly, hide our capacities, and bide our time, be good at maintaining a low profile, and never claim leadership. But apparently, since, let's say, the change of regime and since the early 2000s, that strategy has changed importantly. And I wanted to see your opinion on that, and what are the main and, let's say, structural changes that the Xi Jinping administration has faced.
Excellent. First, let me thank you for pulling together this event. It's great to be able to speak with you and also to reach your audience of students and faculty and others. It's a nice change for me. And I only wish that I could join you in person, although that would bring its own complications. But it's a real pleasure. So great set of questions that we're starting with. I think that you're absolutely right to identify this strange moment in a in a sense, ongoing COVID-19 crisis, a pandemic crisis, which of course here in the United States, we're still feeling quite acutely. And most of the rest of the world is in the same situation, except China. The original origin, we believe, of this pandemic has, again, you're correct in saying, has found a way to deal with it internally, and it seems to be emerging from it economically, certainly more rapidly than just about anyone else. And so that puts it at clearly at an advantage as it seeks to expand its influence, certainly at an economic level, but then, as I write in the book, also potentially in a political, diplomatic level and at a strategic level. So this moment in history seems to be weighted not only with the suffering and immediate consequences for so many people who are ill or have lost jobs and otherwise, but with huge potential geopolitical consequences that will extend for quite possibly the rest of our lifetimes. So this is not a minor affair. But the origins of China's shifting approach to international affairs are not with this pandemic. This goes back in important ways. It goes back literally decades. And then in some ways, it goes to the heart of changes that we're seeing in the current governing structure, and in particular under the head of China right now, President Xi Jinping, has instituted some foreign policy changes that are noteworthy. And so in the book, what I try to do is identify which shifts in China's foreign policy are, you might say, long-term and structural, and which shifts really relate more seriously to a new set of themes that emerged after about 2010, or more specifically after 2012, just over the past decade. So what are these? Long-term, obviously, and we're all very familiar with this, the rise of China and its capacity to turn into the world's economic engine of growth. It was only a matter of time before that economic, fast-paced development, growing economy would translate into some degree of greater global leadership and power. But what we've also seen in all of that is that China, of course, was developing unevenly at home. That is, certain parts of China more connected to the global economy, say Shanghai or cities along its eastern seaboard, were growing very rapidly, whereas other parts of China were growing more slowly to its west, western provinces, in particular places like Xinjiang and otherwise. And so you've seen uneven development inside of China. But that uneven development has led to an effort by China to kind of rebalance. And as I note in the book, that rebalancing process to try to get Western China to grow more rapidly has led China to focus more on Western states in continental Eurasia to try to connect up there. So that's one storyline that has a longer history to it, but has accelerated. The other storyline that you've pointed to is this shift in ambition from what you quoted from the book and quoted from Deng Xiaoping, this sense of hiding your capabilities and biding your time. In other words, being very patient and seeing China's growth and power and wealth, but keeping it under the radar, so to not show off to other states and not to use it as a tool of power. That has now shifted to a new catchphrase under President Xi Jinping of striving for achievement. That is finally taking the mask off and letting the world see China's great power and capability, and really being much more ambitious and much more open in that ambition. And in that process has really happened, as I say, over the past decade. But coming back to COVID, in the past year, that has taken an even more aggressive and pushy face to it. When those of us who are watching China's rhetoric and diplomacy have identified something called wolf warrior diplomats, diplomats who are actually quite nationalistic, quite aggressive, quite critical of other countries, especially the United States, but many other countries as well, and much more eager to express China's greatness and to want the world to hear that in no uncertain terms. So all of these things have changed. Again, some of them have longer term realities and drivers that are more economic in terms of development inside of China, while others are more political and relate very clearly to the present moment. So that's an opening response. There's much more that could be said on any of these things, but I'll leave it there.
Perfect. And in that same line of showing their power and so on, one of the big themes we have seen throughout this year has been a little bit of territorial conflict. Currently, China has between official and unofficial territorial conflicts around 17 situations and things they have been struggling with their neighbors. One of the main conflicts that has happened is in Kashmir and with India. And obviously this involves Pakistan, especially since the last clash actually had some casualties. In that sense, I wanted to ask you if you could introduce us what's the geopolitical situation over there as of well, how China involves Pakistan into this equation and what are their relations with Pakistan and of course the Belt and Road Initiative.
Great. So one of the regions that in this book and actually in my professional career that I've really focused on is South Asia. You mentioned that I had written a previous book on Pakistan and on the US-Pakistan relationship. And it is actually, that's where my interest in the questions about China's role in the region, that's where they began. Because at least a decade ago, when I was looking at the US-Pakistan relationship and Pakistan-India relations and all of the dynamics there, what I came to realize was that many of the dynamics are kind of repeat again and again. India and Pakistan are frequently at odds. We've seen repeated wars and crises over decades now, and those stories are not always the same, but very similar over time. Well, the one big story that we started to see was this increasing importance and involvement of China in the region. And that led me to ask a number of questions, even again back about a decade ago, about how China's greater involvement in South Asia would likely change the relations within the region. And my conclusion, to bring this up to speed, is that China is increasingly involved in Pakistan, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But on the whole, that deeper involvement in Pakistan makes India very nervous and worried about the extension of China's power and military capabilities into its neighborhood. So that puts India on edge. And then when you add to that the fact that actually India and China are also neighbors and have a contested territorial boundary themselves, when you add these things together, you get increasing wariness and concern on India's part, which is driving potential for more crises between both India and China and India and Pakistan. And some of that has to do with India's own internal dynamics, its own politics. Prime Minister Modi is a much more nationalistic, power-oriented leader than his predecessors were. But a lot of it, I think, also relates to these other dynamics, which say more about the evolution of China's role. So you're right, even within the past year, we've seen a spike in clashes between India and China along their contested border, this line of actual control and other parts of that border that extend eastward, that has included the first casualties, something on the order of, well, at least 20, but probably more like dozens more of deaths resulting from armed clashes, and they say unarmed clashes, but actually they have very primitive weapons, bats covered with wire and other things that they're pushing each other down very dangerous ravines and other things. So this is a tough area to fight. Fortunately, it hasn't escalated to the use of aircraft or artillery or anything like that yet, but it is quite possible. And that reflects that both India and China have moved their militaries closer to this contested border and have taken up positions to try to defend these borders. Tactically, they perceive that certain advantages, this is mountainous territory, certain advantages can be gained by taking the heights and basically looking down on the adversary. So both sides have been seeking to advance their tactical opportunities whenever they can. And this is likely to continue. So there is this kind of India-China direct competition. But the other storyline is that over the past decade, China's investment in its relations with Pakistan have taken on a character that we've never seen before. Tens of billions of dollars of Chinese investment, plus just a heavier emphasis on this relationship, have brought the two closer together. And this has happened at the same time as the Pakistan-US relationship has diminished. So whereas the United States, after 9/11, got very involved in Pakistan, over the past decade, our involvement has dwindled. And China has kind of taken over in many ways, has taken the mantle of most involved external player in Pakistan. And if China has any allies in the world, Pakistan is near the top of the list. So that relationship has gotten much closer. And as a consequence, I think many in the United States are worried that Pakistan may be becoming more aggressive toward India, in part because it has the confidence of knowing that China is backing it. Okay, that's one. Simultaneously, gets complicated, but simultaneously, the United States and India have gotten closer as partners. And so, and this is being driven in large part, this is a longer story, but really relates back almost to the Clinton administration, but certainly during the Bush administration, the United States and India have seen their interests as more in alignment. And Washington has been eager to develop a strategic partnership with New Delhi. And so what you've seen is China and Pakistan coming together, the United States and India coming together, and that creates a very dangerous potential for, as US-China competition gets more difficult, it will play out in South Asia, potentially in violent ways, where the United States will see its interest in backing India against China and Pakistan, and China will see its interest in backing Pakistan against the United States and India. So we're setting up a kind of a dangerous bloc politics, which takes place in a region that already has these deep and long-standing hostilities. And of course, the last point would be, this is not an unimportant region. We're talking about India and China with well over 1 billion people, Pakistan with over 200 million people, and all of them nuclear armed. So the potential for catastrophic outcomes are quite real and worth being very concerned about.
It's a dangerous situation. Hopefully everything will be stopped or the situation will be de-escalated. But things are also changing in other sides of the continent, as you point out in your book. One thing I wanted to ask you about is in other terms, especially related to energy. A couple of weeks ago, Beijing announced that they implemented a plan to be carbon neutral by 2060, which is not so far away. So they will be forced to change all their electrical grid and to change their strategy on how to obtain their resources. One of their main actives is going to be nuclear plants, as they pointed out, which obviously is good news for Kazakhstan, one of their neighbors, as they are one of the main uranium producers, but it's bad news for Iran and for Saudi Arabia because of their oil production. What could you tell us about the former situation, or this, let's say, trade level they had in terms of energy production and so on? And what could this mean for the future relations between China, Central Asia, and the Middle East?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the first thing I would say is that the energy story has been and currently is at the center of what has brought China initially into Central Asia and into the Middle East. So if you wanted to tell it in one sentence, the story would be China needs hydrocarbon energy and finds it in these markets and buys it in enormous quantities. That's it. That's the story. Of course, it's not nearly so simple, but that is the first thing that led to significant Chinese investments in the energy sector. You mentioned Kazakhstan, but in the traditional hydrocarbon energy sector, not the nuclear sector, not as much yet. It is the thing that binds China to Iran and to Saudi Arabia and the other states of the Persian Gulf. It is actually at the center of the China-Russia relationship as well, because China buys an enormous amount of energy from Russia. So this is truly the driver for all of these relationships. And it goes both directions. So China wants the energy, but increasingly, especially as global energy prices have gone down, demand has gone down, each one of these countries sees China as an essential buyer of their principal natural resource. So they are in a strange way more dependent on China, the buyer, than China is on them. And that is in part from a smart Chinese strategy to diversify globally its sources of energy. So China buys from Africa and from Asia and from everywhere, really. And in doing so, makes itself less dependent on any single source. And so none of these sellers, even enormous sellers like Saudi Arabia, have gained a leverage over China. All they can do is hope to sell more to the Chinese. And this is an interesting development simply because historically Beijing was quite worried about the potential that it might lose access to significant energy. And now actually it's the reverse problem. It has all different places that it can buy from. And as you pointed out, President Xi Jinping has made a very ambitious agenda for the greening of China's energy resources over time. Now you put your finger on 2060 and said, that's not actually that far away. And yes, in a way that's not that far away. Already have to be planning for it. But in a different way, many different things can happen between now and 2060. 40 years is, not a lifetime, but half a lifetime. And how this will actually play out, of course, is very much up in the air. All energy producers worldwide appreciate that the greening of energy is happening, whether it's from solar or hydro or nuclear or whatever, it's happening. Prices are coming down, costs are coming down on all of those alternative energy sources, and that will change their economies. And so countries, one in particular that I point to, Saudi Arabia, recognize this and have come up with their own schemes for how they will diversify their economies. So at the center of the Saudi Vision 2030 is a plan to translate its current oil wealth in the form of their Saudi Aramco, their major energy producing company, basically take that public, take the resources from that public sale and use that to build up a diverse set of alternative industries. That's their development plan or strategy. And who is at the center of this? Of course, China has to be at the center of this because Chinese investment will be necessary to make that happen. And increasingly with Saudi Arabia having difficult relations, particularly with Europe, but also with the United States, Chinese technologies and Chinese workers and again, Chinese money will be central to this development scheme. That story, and in different ways played out across the region, puts China in a very important place in terms of their energy, their economic diversification strategy. So even if China doesn't reach that goal of 2060 carbon neutral, whatever, even if the hydrocarbon economy persists well beyond that, diversification strategies will be necessary. And as China gets involved with things, loosely under the umbrella of the Belt and Road Initiative, major infrastructure investment to improve the ability to transit across continental Eurasia, each of these countries will have an interest in being a part of that. And that interest will go up and up as they recognize the downward slide of the value of their hydrocarbon resources. So that's another big storyline that, again, China is very much at the center of.
It's quite an incredible story, especially as so many countries are dependent on China. I'm going again, let's focus a little bit on Central Asia. In the last couple of, let's say, months, there has been a huge change or shift in the conception of what a democracy is around the world. Many countries are fighting for their freedom or to have more political freedom, such as, for example, Thailand. But in the case of Central Asia, we are seeing some struggles in Kyrgyzstan. And that might spread around, and all these strong men, especially in the region, who has controlled the region since the fall of the Soviet Union, might have some challenges and may change the status quo, especially in a place where Russia and China have extremely important interests. What do you think this might signify for China, whether it's a good resource, is a good opportunity for them, or it's going to be more challenging, especially given that an anti-Chinese sentiment is also growing in the region and they're more pro-Russia in terms of cultural affinity? Do you see there might be a challenge to these countries or these governments, or the status quo might remain as it is right now?
Well, that's a tough one to predict the politics of Central Asia. Predicting the politics in the United States is hard enough. Predicting the politics in Central Asia is another level of complexity. But I will say a couple of things. One would be Kyrgyzstan has known the oppositional politics and the ups and downs of different leaders over the past 2 decades. This is a part for Kyrgyzstan. This is a kind of a longer story. People have come and gone from office. At times, the United States and others who are see themselves as more pro-democracy have hoped really that Kyrgyzstan could reform itself politically and become a model for democracy in a challenging neighborhood. Most of the time we've been disappointed. And if you look at the other countries of Central Asia, that disappointment goes even deeper. When you talk about strongman rule, think about Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, certainly in each one of these cases. And Kazakhstan being in most ways the most important economy, not the most necessarily culturally important or population-wise important, that would go to Uzbekistan. But in terms of important economy and geography, Kazakhstan is the critical piece here. And there you've seen effectively one-man rule. Even now, Nazarbayev stands behind the scenes and pulls the strings and controls a great deal of what happens in Kazakhstan. Since its founding, this hasn't changed. So there's a period of stability, political stability, which is good and bad. It is repressive, it is not illiberal, it is not democratic, but it has enabled a certain type of some economic growth, important economic growth over the whole span of that. Maybe not as good as anyone would like, but with some dips and so on. But that stability has made Kazakhstan very attractive to outside investors, including some Western investors, but especially Chinese investors. And getting to your question, I think that stability broadly is what Beijing craves, what they most want to see. So I do not think that Beijing really cares about what kind of government other states have. that as long as they can work with them and as long as they can expect stability. So a strongman rule is okay as long as that is maintained and likely to be maintained over time. A democratic rule is okay too, as long as it doesn't bring nasty surprises from elections, which it does, unfortunately. So that the Chinese, at times that this causes great headaches in Beijing. The thing about, and you point to what I would call Sinophobia or anti-Chinese sentiment, which is increasing in the region. This, you're right, is a potentially dangerous combination of a question of possible change in leadership, political unrest, combined with a broader wariness and skepticism about China. And in Kazakhstan, you definitely see this. Ethnic Kazakhs, unfortunately, have at times been sucked into and been victims of China's campaign against Uyghurs inside of China, in Xinjiang. And ethnic Kazakhs have been basically imprisoned with them and have been pulled into these so-called re-education camps. Some of them have escaped back to Kazakhstan, where they tell these terrible stories about the repression that's ongoing inside of China. And so there's a widespread fear of what China is doing and anger about what China has done. And at the same time, a Russian, now generations of Russian propaganda and continued messaging into Kazakhstan about how China is evil and dangerous and Russia is good. And so this continues. And so you're right, you basically get the potential for an unraveling of politics, possibly even at the extreme, a kind of a surprise unraveling in a place like Kazakhstan. At the same time, as you have an underlying popular anti-Chinese sentiment. That is, to answer your question, something that Beijing should be nervous about. And they should be thinking more deeply about how they can push back against that and confront that. But for the moment, what I mainly see is a China that is working with the most powerful leaders in each of these countries, enriching them, supporting them, backing them up, basically is heavily invested in their stability and success. And at least at the moment in Kazakhstan as well, the same regime remains in power. And so this seems like the best bet for the moment. But as I come back to the beginning, predicting politics there is very difficult. And if I were China, I would be somewhat nervous about that.
It makes total sense. And it's quite worrisome, especially related to the anti-Chinese sentiment, which is spreading, including Europe. In the last polls, we can see there has been an anti-Chinese sentiment. Like it's expanding quite rapidly, and there's been some confrontations. But going to another topic, which is more related to their excess capacity situation, the coronavirus has basically stopped a little bit their exports of excess capacity. They're not producing so much in other countries, they're not building so much. But even so, during these times of during this pandemic, they have struck some deals, some important deals, especially with Iran and also with Saudi Arabia, regarding to nuclear projects, especially related to energy. And as you point out really well in your book, is that Iran always goes to China when they need to bypass all the restrictions imposed by the West, mainly by the US. And of course, Saudi Arabia does something similar when they want to be unnoticed, especially when they buy some missiles or defense systems. Could you explain us a little bit how this works, how they can actually manage to bypass all the security systems from the West, and what does that mean to the current situation in the region, especially let's say, this Cold War they're having between Saudi Arabia and Iran? What can this mean?
Right. So I think One point that I would make, and this relates to the overall framing, how I look at each one of these regions in the book. I ask two basic questions. One is, how is China's involvement affecting politics within specific countries? So in the Middle East, I look at Iran in particular. How is China's investment affecting the Iranian regime and its relations with its people? And the second set of questions is, how is China's involvement affecting the dynamics within the region? And that gets more to the questions that you're asking, which is, how is Iran's relationship with Saudi Arabia and their long-standing competition, generally competitive, hostile relationship, how is that affected by China? And what I find is that both Iran and Saudi Arabia see China as an increasingly important partner in their ability to pursue that competition with each other. Some of this is not new. You mentioned missile sales, right? The Saudis began buying missiles and nuclear capable missiles, which has been very worrisome for other countries, Israel and the United States and others, because they started buying them from China decades ago, because they knew they could never buy them from the United States, that we would be unwilling to sell them, even though we're the principal arms dealer to the Saudis. They knew they had to go elsewhere, so they secretly went to China and bought them from China. But Iran's need for China goes much deeper than that. Iran needs China, first of all, as a buyer of its oil, but also as it provides many of the goods to the Iranian market now that Iran has less access to goods from elsewhere, and is a major technology provider to Iran in this internet age. Iran's internet is basically built with Chinese technology, and Iran's capacity to control its internet is enabled by Chinese technologies, including surveillance technologies and overall censorship technologies. So Iran finds itself really vulnerable and in what you might say an asymmetric relationship of power with China, where China has the power and Iran needs its help. So it's vulnerable, dependent on China. But Saudi Arabia also is at some level vulnerable and dependent on China. The combination, when you add this up, is you have, I try to describe it as almost like China has two lovers in the Middle East. Both of them are courting China. Both of them are eager to have China reciprocate that affection. And China is in a great position where it can choose not to choose. It can have both Iran and Saudi Arabia. But the difference, I think, is ultimately that Iran needs China even more than Saudi Arabia needs China. And Iran is willing to do more. And so you mentioned earlier that Iran has now entered into, or is rumored to be entering into, a long-term, they're calling it a strategic partnership, 25-year deal with China. Millions of dollars of promised Chinese investment. In return, it seems like Iran may grant greater access to Iranian territory for China. There may be more military cooperation. Possibly, one could imagine, even opportunities for Chinese basing along Iran's coast. So these things are changing, and Iran sees all of this as very helpful. First, for dealing with Saudi Arabia, a regional foe, but maybe more importantly, for buffering itself from the United States, from US sanctions and pressure. So you asked about that. You know, over the past few years, the Trump administration, as I'm sure many of you know, withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal and reimposed its own unilateral sanctions on Iran, and effectively has been trying to squeeze Iran, not just from US sanctions against Iran, but threatening sanctions against other companies and other countries that might involve themselves in Iran, which has scared away the Europeans. So most of the European companies that might have invested in Iran just simply can't do it. They're worried about banking access in the United States, and they see it as not worthwhile. I'm sorry, getting a phone call. Oh, that should go away. So they have been, the European companies have been kept out. China has also, to be clear, been very nervous about its investments in Iran and has gone slowly for fear of the US reprisals against China. And of course, all this is happening with the US-China trade negotiations and so on. So China has been looking to avoid more fights. So what it has done is very quietly, and from a US perspective, illegally or stealthily, been continuing to purchase lower levels of Iranian oil, but doing so in ways that circumvent US sanctions through a variety of mechanisms in terms of holding of Iranian cargo, sometimes keeping it offshore or having it go to some third country, a variety of mechanisms like this, which have enabled Iran and its regime to have some continued flow of resources, money from China to keep them alive in the face of heavy US pressure. And it's also enabled China to buy and make oil contracts very cheaply with Iran and have this potential long-term access to Iranian markets. So what we're seeing is increasingly, I think if this continues, and there's no guarantee that it will continue, say if Biden administration comes in, the US-Iran relationship may shift a bit. Iran would like to have more investment from Europe if possible. So it may shift away from China a bit. But if this current trend continues, Iran will find itself very firmly in China's orbit, in its sphere of influence, and very closely aligned with China in the decades to come, which would be a very interesting development for the Middle East, where China really hasn't had that degree of influence or involvement historically.
Well, this is quite relevant, especially for the future. And now having 2 more weeks before the US elections, and we know that this is going to provoke a huge shift in international relations, especially on how the State Department works in the United States. I wanted to ask you as a final question, what does this mean? How, for example, a change in president, for example, if the incumbent goes out and Biden takes the position, what's going to be the change in the relations with the region? Or do you think that a new Trump administration is going to maintain the same strategy? What do you think this might mean for the region and the US relations?
Well, I think that the most important difference between a Biden administration and a continued Trump administration is no question is the nature of the US relationship with our allies. That's the centerpiece, right? There will be a great deal of continuity, frustration, concern, even some hostility between the United States and China, or the United States and Russia, no matter who is in office, no matter whether it's Trump or Biden going forward. But the US relationship with Europe, with NATO, with our traditional allies and friends like Japan, Korea, I think would be significantly improved in a Biden administration. The Trump administration's approach to these relations has been very strange and abnormal for an American president. Of course, previous presidents were worried that our NATO partners weren't paying enough for their defense and so on. There were always disputes with France about different ways of pursuing policies. We disagreed with much of Europe, say on the Iraq War, so there's always been differences. But the reduction of efforts at cooperation with these traditional partners during the Trump administration is something we've never seen before. So the first order of business for a Biden administration, I think, that would occupy it, certainly for its first year and possibly for all of the first term, would be to regrow and rebuild and re-energize these relationships. And these traditional alliance relationships. And that would serve as the foundation for future American competition and dealings with China. That's the fundamental difference. So a US government working under a Biden administration would seek to firm up its relations with allies to then use that to put more pressure on China and on Russia. Whereas a Trump administration has seen, for a variety of reasons, has worked unilaterally, has seen frayed relations with traditional allies, and has had a kind of a on-again, off-again, strange reaction and dealings with both China and Russia. So this is a very big difference. And for most of us, I will say, sitting in Washington, D.C., the past 4 years has felt kind of like Alice in Wonderland. Everything is upside down. And we are craving a return to something that seems at least more normal in our understanding of how US policy should be. Certain foundational concepts, certain relations should go back to the way that they were, even if nothing will be exactly the same, both because of Trump and because of COVID and because the world moves on. Nothing will be the same, but certain things I think can rebound and be rebuilt.
Perfect. Just a last question on the same topic. In your book, you explain a little bit how the relationship between the US and Russia may influence in all the region, especially regarding to Central Asia and Iran, as, for example, Russia is their main defensive ally in Iran, and also it's one of the main influences in Central Asia. Obviously, we know that Trump has kind of a good relationship with Russia up to a certain point, but we can expect a little bit more from a Biden presidency, probably. But also in the same line, Russia is facing their own situation, especially regarding to their own social unrest in the East, and also regarding to Belarus, which might open the gates to, let's say, a huge social struggle in the country. In that sense, seeing the election and what might implicate for the US-Russia relationships, do you think that a change to a Biden presidency might actually might improve the relationship between the two countries and at the same time improve the situation in the regions we have analyzed? Or do you think the Trump administration might be the same?
I think that the Biden administration, just like most new presidents in Washington, President Obama, President Bush, President Trump, every single one has come in with some sense that they might be able to, we use the word reset, frequently reset the relations with Moscow. And I would imagine that President Biden would attempt to do so as well. Not in a dramatic sense, because I think there's a much stronger appreciation for just how different US and Russian interests are in the world, and that we cannot fully bridge that. But I would imagine that I know that there would be an effort to try to manage those differences more effectively. More of I could imagine something that looks a little bit more like a truce or an effort to pull back from active hostility. So of course, one of the major issues that a Biden administration would be most worried about is continued Russian interference in our own politics here at home. I think that a Biden administration, unlike a Trump administration, would see that as having been a direct attack on US democracy, and would respond accordingly, and would put that at the center of our response to Russia. But how they would push back, I think they would probably begin by trying to explore opportunities for a negotiated ceasefire on this issue. So rather than taking a more aggressive approach to Russia, at least at the beginning, I think they would be looking for maybe there's a way that we can each pull back. So that we would have to make commitments about not interfering in Russia, and they would have to make verifiable commitments about not interfering here, and maybe pursue that. This has implications for cybersecurity, for propaganda and other kind of social media campaigns and other media campaigns. We've really never tried to do that exactly. These are new areas. We've had negotiations on arms control, nuclear missiles and things like that, but not negotiations of a similar sort on how to have rules for staying out of each other's politics. These are the kinds of things I think they would explore. Unfortunately, I'm nervous that I don't think that these are going to work very well. I think that, unfortunately, the history has suggested that Russia is more opportunistic, more aggressive than that, and that a Biden administration will try, but probably have very limited success. But it's worth a try. And part of why it's worth at least hoping for relates back to China. Right now, Russia is alone, and increasingly dependent on its relations with China. And it is the weaker party. It is the smaller, diminished country in that bilateral relationship. And it stands to lose as China continues to grow. And in particular, in Central Asia, China's influence is growing and Russia's influence is waning. And this makes Moscow upset. This will make Russia feel weaker and smaller as a consequence. So I think that recognizing that and recognizing that Russia would have something to gain from rebalancing its relations with the West, maybe they would pursue these types of less aggressive, less hostile, and somewhat marginally more cooperative relations with the United States. But things like the events in Ukraine and now playing out elsewhere, this type of kind of unrest, this makes Moscow very nervous. And behind every instance of this, they see Western manipulation and the potential for increasingly either more democratic or at least more opposed to Russia style of politics, which they deeply dislike. And so the possibility is that they will just further entrench Putin-style politics, further entrench an anti-Western sentiment in Russia that no president in Washington, D.C. will be able to unwind. That's quite possible as well.
Perfect. Now I'm going to open the mic to questions to see if there is a question. I just received a question from one of my colleagues. He actually asked me something quite particular about the Pakistani-India relation and how China might influence that. One of the theories we have been discussing around here is that China is using up to a certain point the Pakistan-Indian conflict as a way to actually direct, let's say, Indian resources into that, let's say, conflict instead of investing in a navy and, let's say, controlling the sea routes around India. So I wanted to ask you your opinion whether this might be true, especially considering that China is investing in huge ports around India, especially in Pakistan, and now they have maybe options in Iran. Also, they have Djibouti, where they can actually take their military fleets. But the Malacca Strait is not being contested as it should be by India right now, because they're just throwing all their money into the Pakistani conflict up to a certain point. What's your view on that?
Yeah, a short answer would be yes. Yes, I think that's a fair characterization of China's strategy, but this is not new. I think the reality is that China has perceived the strategic utility of Pakistan for decades, and China's sense of that value in Pakistan has been the principal driver for their bilateral relationship since the 1960s. Remember that India and China had fought a war in 1962. And though China was the decisive victor in that war, improved relations with Pakistan evolved thereafter between China and Pakistan. Their military-to-military relationship and intelligence sharing relationship, and even, one would have to say, China's support to Pakistan's nuclear program and its missile program, by far its biggest help in its conventional weapons program, tanks and and a variety of other platforms have all come from China. So throughout all of this, China has seen Pakistan as a useful balancer for India and distraction for India. And the question for Beijing has always been, how far should they allow Pakistan to push? Because it's always been a bit of a dangerous game, because the potential for an India-Pakistan major war, even as I said earlier, even a nuclear war, is real. And so China has wanted to push the problem enough to a point that they place pressure on India, force India to invest in tools of war in its military to use against Pakistan, but not so far, not pushed so far that they end up back in an outright war between the two sides. And that's been a bit of a calibrated balancing act. I think that even that now this continues, but I think that China also has, has mixed interests, and we shouldn't see this, this isn't a simple story, because China has also at various times hoped that it could get better relations with India, that it could invest more significantly in India, that India's expanding population and growing economy would be a boost for China's own economy, that it would be a new driver for the global economy, a consumer of Chinese goods, a place for Chinese investors to go, an export opportunity for, you mentioned overcapacity, for Chinese overcapacity. India needs more infrastructure, more steel, more everything that China has in abundance. India could conceivably be a consumer of. So China has wanted to see India in that way too. And so this has been a difficult game, because on the one hand, China strategically has wanted to make India's life difficult with Pakistan. And on the other hand, some in Chinese, certainly in the business community, have wanted to improve relations with India. So you've seen a kind of a two-faced Chinese strategy toward India over the years. And just in this past year, one of those faces has become much smaller. The friendly face has become smaller as India and China have seen these fights along their contested borders, as India's skepticism and anger toward China has grown. And as India has now imposed greater limits on Chinese investment in the Indian economy, and has grown closer to the United States, to Europe, and even to Australia and Japan, this seems like a greater barrier to the China-India relationship. And the worrisome consequence of this is that China will simply not see a need to balance its relations with India and become, more fully a hostile power on India's doorstep. That's not actually good for anybody. That's not really good for India. Some in the United States are happy about this because it maybe makes India more eager to be good friends with Washington, to come to the United States as a balancing partner against China. But the broader regional consequences of India-China hostility, these two enormous Asian powers, would be bad for human development in India and in the rest of the world, would be bad for the global economy, would be bad for peace in the region. And so it's something to be wary about, to not see as a positive development.
Perfect. It's a really good answer. And one last question, which comes from our audience. It is related to human rights. As they write, today's Economist cover is about the Uyghur imprisonment camps and what is happening in many regions, especially in Mongolia, and the Uyghur situation. And of course, this will imply some important economic struggles to China, especially because many companies are withdrawing their factories into other countries because of the human rights violations. And the word decoupling is becoming quite common around the world. In that sense, do you think this might imply a deeper relation with the regions we have analyzed, as they are not going to decouple from China because of the dependency on the Asian giant? Or do you think this is going to pass after a couple of months and it's not going to have a huge impact in the area?
Well, again, what do they say? Predicting, there's nothing so hard as predicting the future, or something like that. I mean, I struggle to, I think a lot of different potential outcomes are there, but I will say, you're right to identify these regions that we've talked about as being less capable of decoupling their economies from China. And increasingly, they will be even less capable of decoupling than they even are now. Because first of all, as we've already identified, they have supply and demand relations with China of mainly what they sell, again, energy. China is their principal buyer, so that will continue. But the other things that are happening that will further link these economies to China have to do with telecommunications and physical hard infrastructure, where all roads and cables lead back to Beijing, either literally or figuratively. Figuratively, by that I mean that their telecommunications backbones being built by Chinese companies mean that they need continued Chinese technology, and that they will be locked into Chinese standards, which will make them a part of a broader Chinese economy. And the costs to decoupling will just go sky high. And so there's a potential for the lock-in of China in these economies in a way that doesn't even exist yet, that could grow over time. So now you have that storyline of a gradual and likely lock-in of Chinese companies and technologies and standards and control in these economies. Simultaneously, you have this question you asked about human rights and Uyghurs. And remember that these countries, it's not just Kazakhstan, most of these countries are majority Muslim. Many of them you would think would have grave concerns and fears over what China is doing at home to its own Muslim populations. And you would expect that that might create a backlash, and that they might like to, if they could, decouple or otherwise distance themselves from China in ways that others in the West and elsewhere are doing. Where I would say we should all watch very closely is in the ability of the leaders of these countries, say Iran, to manage their own opposition within their countries on this issue of the Uyghurs. So if you think about it in a simple terms, the leadership of Iran, this clerical leadership, nominally Islamist, and you would think would care about other Muslims around the world, including in China, but is also totally in bed with Beijing, needs China's support to keep them in power in their own countries. So they are compromised ideologically, but dependent upon China. And their opposition forces within Iran, whether they're the green forces, the more so-called liberal, moderate forces, or even actually hardline clerics who are more ideologically anti-China and concerned about what's happening to Muslims. Either way, the question is, how will they use that anger as a mobilizing force to push back against their own leaders? And so it's the internal struggles that are likely to play out in each one of these societies. How will they be managed? Because most of the people in these regions, these are not democratic countries. So the people don't really have a choice about their leaders, at least not a democratic choice. So they have to mobilize politically, they have to mobilize as an opposition force. And so the question is, will they be able to do that against these leaders? Will the China story lead them to come together in their opposition to to their own leaders. And then the last point would be, in all of this, China is also providing the leaders the tools of repression to keep the opposition weak. So again, in Iran, it's Chinese technology which runs the Iranian internet and which provides Iran's leaders the capacity to turn off the internet if the protests become too large, to literally turn off the internet so that nobody has access. So China is providing them with other technologies, facial recognition and other things, to enable them to better control their populations. So this gets to be a very scary kind of dystopian, illiberal story across this region. I don't think it's so simple as that. I think it will be very much contested over time. But the implication over a period of time for this region, that it would be kind of drawn into a Chinese orbit from which it would be very difficult to escape. This is a frightening proposition. I think it's frightening for us outside of the region. I also think many people in the region are frightened by that prospect and will try to delay it and try to forestall it or keep it from happening. And that's an important thing to recognize. They have some power. They have to keep pushing, and they have an interest in at least governing themselves, if not democratically, at least maintaining some autonomy. I think that will be very important to judging how this plays out.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor Markey. Again, everyone, the title of the book is China's Western Horizon, Beijing and the New Geopolitics of Eurasia. You can buy it through Amazon here in Chile. I totally recommend it. It's a way to introduce yourself into the region, to learn about geopolitics. It's extremely well written, and all these small pieces of this complex relationship between China and the rest of the region starts to make sense after the book. Thank you again, and obviously to all our spectators in all our social networks, Zoom, YouTube, and all social networks. And thank you again, Professor Markey, for this incredible opportunity to talk with you and to learn a little bit more on this issue.
Thank you. It was really my pleasure. Great questions, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much again.